Hi, what's up?
I was pinged by people a week or so ago, and the quote was that you don't believe companies should be able to buy each other, and they wanted me to talk to you about this.
Yeah, persuade me out of it. I don't like it.
What do you not like about it?
I don't like the idea that like a person's goal is to like start a company and then sell it to a bigger company. I feel like the vertical and horizontal reach that so many companies have now across like sectors just feels super fucking toxic and not like a good business environment. Like when I'm thinking of like competition between different manufacturers, between different stages of the supply chain, between different people that are selling goods or services to consumers, I'm not thinking like one guy can just buy up every single thing that that comes along to make their company the best thing it can be. It just feels stupid to me. Like Google shouldn't be making cell phones and ad service and email and like like yeah, that's right. Go ahead, yeah. I don't have like a strong stance on it. It feels like revolting, but maybe there's like a good reason why it has to be this way or something.
Well, I mean, I think that so I would just say that there's utility to,
of course,
generally like private allocation of capital,
yeah.
Right? That, you know, when owners of businesses can decide what to do with that ownership, it can lead to good outcomes.
Yeah.
You know, a couple examples would be like, you know, a company that has lower access to capital but has a good idea. You know, they can sell that idea to a bigger company that has better access to capital and expand.
Yeah, but
on
I feel
that
like there's a
idea,
difference
right?
between like access to capital versus like companies just buying you. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with like capital investment. I'm not like full on socialist now where I don't think anybody should be able to invest. I just don't like the idea of like large companies buying up other companies to improve their product or service.
Right. Okay, so
You should be able to raise money,
so
of course.
you're,
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
well, yeah, but raising capital is like part of that could be an equity deal with another big company, right? So like for instance,
Yeah,
one
but
example
that's-
is
or go ahead. I mean,
yeah,
that's what I'm talking about, clearly, right? Like you should be able to raise capital. I know that other companies could also invest in other companies, but I'm saying that I don't like that model of like companies investing and buying parts of their supply chain and shit. I just don't like that.
Right. Okay. So you're. It sounds like the big thing is vertical integration, right?
Vertical
Like
and
when companies
horizontal.
start-
Yeah, but yes, yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, it sounds like okay, yeah. Because what I was quoted was like, Destiny just doesn't think any company should buy any other company, which sounds like
I mean, that's kind
a
of
less
a,
defensible.
yeah. To a normal person, I would say that, but yeah, I mean, like obviously, like private equity or like investment or hedge funds are going to be a little bit different than what I'm talking about, right? Like Amazon buying like trucks and grocery stores, or Google buying like doing phones and everything else.
Right, or like I don't know, like a small landscape, like the guy who owns a small landscaping company selling his business to some
A bigger
conglomerate and
landscape.
retiring or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's probably a little bit, that's a little bit different. I see what you're saying. I mean, obviously I don't think, it's not that these companies, in my view, shouldn't be allowed to do that, right? Like if Google wants to, for instance, like if Google sees a change in business model or like a value opportunity, I think them like buying assets and trying to buy talent to maintain that competitive edge, or like for instance, like say a company like Shell, a big oil company, realizes that the energy transition's happening, them being able to purchase renewable energy talent and different companies and energy transition people so that they can grow that within their company instead of having to sort of get all these oil people to now do renewables. That's probably an easier transition than somehow being able, paying consultants, I guess.
I understand. Hold on. Let's skip all the boring parts. Obviously, obviously, horizontal and vertical integration of companies represents a huge interest to the companies, and it can represent the huge interest to the consumers, right? We both agree with that, obviously, right? Integration is going to smooth a lot of these things out.
Sure.
And it's going to make things better for everybody, of course, right? Do you understand the negatives of what I'm talking about? That it feels weird that we have so many markets where, how does Facebook buy Instagram, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Or how do you get these, huge mergers where, how do you ever have a market like Intel control, 96% of, CPUs, or NVIDIA controls 92% of GPUs, or a company like Google or Amazon is allowed to buy any company ever, right? I understand that it represents some fluidity in their transactions within the company and then to customers as well, but it feels like we're way past anything that I would ever consider monopoly or monopoly or what do you call it when multiple companies are kind of in control of it, 2 or 3 companies has
Oligopoly.
Okay, yeah, oligopoly. Yeah, it just seems insane to me. I don't know what antitrust means in the United States right now. I have no idea what that means.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's
Like
I think
Google
it's fair to
buying
criticize.
Waze. Yeah. Because I went to use Waze like a year ago and I noticed that. How the fuck does Google buy Waze? That's insane to me, right? I don't understand at all.
Or like Google getting into phones and getting into AI. You know, they're getting it's just big companies getting into
make
everything.
a new company
or like
for it. Break them up.
Amazon.
Do it with something different, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that's a much more fair statement to say that some of these big companies should be broken up, or like there should be, more sort of regulatory scrutiny on that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's part of what, I think, for instance, I think the Biden admin blocked a big merger somewhat. I think it was maybe the Time Warner Comcast merger or something. There's some big merger, I think, that Biden's
We have
admin
like
came
3
in and stopped.
ISPs in the United States. These ISPs shouldn't be merging with anybody ever. Yeah.
Well, right. I mean, part of it is just the administration, right? So, like, I think that, for instance, Clinton went after Microsoft for antitrust, and then Bush came in and said, we're cool with that, and we're just going to drop all the investigations, right? And so, and at the time, Microsoft had like a pretty powerful monopoly on personal computers, right?
They still do, right? Isn't like 90% of computers still like Microsoft computers, Windows computers?
I honestly don't know how the market share has changed over time. I really don't. I think the problem that the Clinton administration kind of pointed out was, and this was the basis of their investigation, wasn't necessarily just the market share. It was that they were pairing their market share with ancillary products. So basically, they tried to boost Internet Explorer because they had this huge market share of personal desktops. And basically, that was an example of where a company is trying to take advantage of their monopoly power.
Yeah, of course.
To
I
try
mean, like,
and,
look at, it sounds like kind of shitty, but like, honest to God, I don't think I would ever buy a non-Android phone if a competitor came out just because the integration that Google offers is so good. But like, that's kind of fucked up. That's kind of stupid, right? Like,
Apple
should never.
offers.
Yeah, same thing with Apple as well. Apple is highly vertically integrated with their software and hardware. So it's like, would you ever buy, if you're part of the iPhone ecosystem or if you're part of the Google ecosystem, you're like locked in. But not because they're making the best products, they've got the most innovative things. It's just because you're locked in vertically to ancillary products, like you're saying. Yeah, it just seems so stupid.
No, that makes
like
sense. I mean, it's the same thing as like. No, it's the same thing as like Tesla, how like only like yes, for some reason only a Tesla charger should be able to charge a Tesla, electric vehicle, and it's like this is just clearly a way to take advantage of their market power in EVs, right? Because you have to use Tesla chargers for your fucking Tesla, right? When that doesn't really make any sense. There should probably be like a similar like how all your home outlets are all interchangeable, right? You don't have like a fucking Apple branded home outlet. It's all the same shit, right? That's true. Not yet. I'm not sure if smart homes, Apple sponsored corporate, neighborhoods are a thing at this point. But no, I mean, that obviously that's a more defensible position. People were pinging me like Destiny just doesn't believe in the concept of mergers and acquisitions, which is
sure. I mean, like obviously, there's some things, but yeah. Do you agree that I don't like this idea, right? Like I'm gonna make a company so that I can get it big and sell it to a bigger company, like a huge company. I don't like that approach to. Yeah. I just feel like it's very unhealthy economic activity. I don't think it's a good way to go. Like I mean, like I don't hate the business owners of the business or whatever. I feel like it's not healthy for like good markets. But yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Well, it's not just unhealthy. I mean, it could literally be like a scam, right? I mean, look at like WeWork is an example of. It seemed like WeWork was an example where this guy basically said, okay, I've got a 10% of a good idea. I'm going to try and go public, and then it's someone else's problem because I'll go public and just cash out and fuck everybody else. This business model is probably not that profitable, right? Yeah. And you saw something sort of similar when Lyft and Uber went public, right? Was that you had a bunch of like original investors cashing out on the IPO, and then basically the public shareholders were now on the hook for this now more transparent business model, and it turns out, well, it's not actually very profitable at all. Yeah. Right.
Like I don't know how many like.
And you see that a lot with tech companies.
Yeah, especially. I was gonna say I don't know how many Silicon Valley guys but you're never gonna have a competitor to Google because when you start a company, your goal is to like sell to Google or to sell to some other large like software company. Like that's the goal. So like you're never gonna see competition for any of these products because why would you? You're trying to sell to these guys,
Yeah. I mean, that's totally fair. I think it sounds like you would say that almost like there should probably be a more expansive view because typically I think most of the time monopolies. Well, yeah, like most of the time monopolies can get away with being monopolies as long as as long as generally consumers are pretty happy with the product and they don't sort of incredibly overtly take advantage of their monopoly power, right? This is where you see like Standard Oil getting in trouble. Like Standard Oil comes in, buys all the fucking oil companies, and then raises the prices, right? But if you're offering a competitive product, still.
I'm worried about the opportunity cost, though, right? Because it's the idea that, like, we're not going to see a bunch of competing operating systems, which might be, like, really cool. We're not going to really see a bunch of, like, competing phone brands, which might be really cool. We're just going to see, like, people trying to sell to big tech companies and then people building around these pre-existing products, basically.
Yeah. I mean, that's understandable. I think that, I think the more interesting question is, like, the utility of just more heavily regulating or socializing those companies versus actually just breaking them up, because I can imagine some industries where some monopoly is probably okay, right? Like there actually might be utility to some industries being quasi-monopolies, right? I think that sports leagues are a good example. Now those are technically trade organizations, but essentially the NFL is like a monopoly on playing football professionally, and that's kind of cool because you get all the best football players all playing with each other. Right, you don't want to have like, the NBA, like you don't want to have like LeBron James and fucking like Kyrie Irving in separate leagues because you want to see them play together. And so just heavily regulating that versus breaking it up probably makes more sense. Or like social media could be another example where, it might be okay to have a few big social media companies because you have everyone kind of on the same company and you don't have to download like 30 different apps, right? But obviously that's a different conversation. I think the general principle, though, that you're outlining, which is that, these companies are probably too big, right? And there should probably be antitrust regulations or some sort of, socialization or something like that happens. I think that could make sense.
Yeah, I don't think I necessarily disagree. Yeah.
Oh, hey, on globalism, Econoboi, it seems like the idea of globalism, at least as a political tool, is kind of dying. What are your thoughts on that? Because like I've just been listening to some economics, and I don't know how to parse what it is or isn't true, because it seems like economics in general has had to come to some pretty hard truths over the past like 5 years.
When you say globalism as a political tool, what do you mean by that?
So like there was this idea in the like 90s and early 2000s that as China grew and became more integrated with the global markets, it would become more democratic, and we would export our values along with our money into their markets. Am I?
Yeah,
like,
I think that. No. I remember. I've never heard it used in that way. What was it? I can't remember. There's an actual like concept for what you're talking about, but I know what you're talking about. I mean, that theory. The problem with that theory is that it's proven. It's just there's a lot of examples of it kind of working and not working, right? So like you can look at like the Asian tigers are examples of, Hong Kong is not very democratic, but that's because of China's overreach. But like Taiwan and South Korea, as they economically developed, became more democratic, right? But then like China seems to be going almost the opposite direction, right? So I think that theory has been proven false, right? That it turns out just economic growth and like generic economic prosperity doesn't necessarily cause people to be more democratic. There's some theories of democratization that claim the opposite, right? They'll use like Singapore as an example, where the government of Singapore is, let's say, nominally democratic. It's sort of like a Hungarian-style democracy, where they have like the ruling party has like really strict controls on opposition party speech and media, but opposition parties can run, right? It's like it's a fair election, but it's not free, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah.
And and like Singapore is an example where people don't, but at the same time, people don't really hate that because the government of Singapore is not very corrupt and they deliver pretty good government services through economic development and investment. And so to some degree, if a more authoritarian government proves that they're at least competent at being a government, people won't necessarily hate it, right? Or if democratic institutions are viewed as being unstable, like I think it was like during the 80s and 90s in Latin America, when there was like so much instability in Latin American governments of, democracies, military coups, back to democracies, but the democracies were super corrupt. There's a significant portion, there's interesting polling where people in Latin American countries, majorities or like significant pluralities of people actually preferred military rule because they just viewed the military government as being better at providing government services
Doesn't
and
that arguably
providing
happen
stability.
in Turkey a little bit, where like the military steps in to kind of like pump the brakes on like coups and shit from
Well, right. I mean, some people view democracies as unstable and corrupt because sometimes democracies are unstable and corrupt in these developing countries, right? So anyway, that's just a long explanation for that. I kind of agree with you, Forethought, that the theory of just open up trade and open up borders and that'll create more robust democracies doesn't really seem to be true. You probably need more. You need more than just that. I think a lot of it has to do with
Your mom.
how. Yeah.
So sorry.
True. A lot of it has to do with institution building, right, and how you root out corruption in government, and how you engender confidence in the government from people. Like one of the problems with like Afghanistan's democracy after the Taliban fell in the early 2000s was that it was really corrupt and it wasn't really a well-functioning government. And so, of course, nobody voted in the elections, which meant that they didn't have very much democratic legitimacy because the government of Afghanistan they weren't a good government, right? Like nobody's going to vote in your election if they feel like their vote doesn't mean anything and they feel like the government is super corrupt, right? That's one of the problems with the Iraqi democracy right now. It's like the turnout rate's like 30 or 40% because they just don't really give that much of a shit about who wins the election because the government isn't very stable and doesn't provide, very good government services, and it doesn't have very much institutional strength.
I see. One of the books I'd read on that was, I think, was Why Nations Fail. I'd read some critique on it, but I didn't find a lot that was made a lot of sense. I saw a lot of historical critique. Do you critique that as an institutionalist from an economic perspective? That book. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh, just as a quick note, academics, it's a rule. As soon as you join academia, you've got to make like this pledge where you hate all generalists in every single fucking discipline ever. So anytime there's a book like I'm guessing Why Nations Fail is probably like a generalistically written book that tries to tie together a lot of narratives. Every fucking specialist who's a fucking loser because he has no way to make any of his research like relevant to any individual human and nobody cares what they do will always come out and like criticize like every single fucking thing about it. Just as a heads up. Not to say that it's a good book or a bad book, but that's like
there are like some books where that criticism makes a lot of sense. Like Sapiens is just fucking horrific.
Yeah,
like
I'm not saying all the criticisms are bad. I'm just saying that's a rule. Like academics will never defend generalist material ever, ever.
So what's like the main? I haven't read it. I've heard of it, but what's the main like claims of that book?
Oh yeah, the main thrust is that the idea that you can have some sort of predictive power over whether or not a nation will succeed in various markers based on how its institutions are constructed to be open and fair and to be economically inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, based on what you've just told me, I think that's completely correct, right? That like the success of a country or a government is very much dependent on how its different economic and political institutions are set up, right? And you can draw the stories of different developing countries that became like lower income countries that became middle income, or like middle income countries that became higher income. It does seem to me to be almost entirely a story of institutional strength, because a lot of the neoclassical or like Washington consensus analysis just doesn't work, right? Like when you look at developed countries today, none of them used like the Washington consensus, just completely free flow of capital and goods and services. No, like they had industrial policy. Almost every developed country had like very, very strict industrial policy that led to certain investments, specialization of labor, foreign investment capital coming in with limited, limited rights, right? And then taking that capital, circulating it internally, and then becoming more developed. And a lot of that was on the back of anti-corruption campaigns, transparent government, right? People use the example of Botswana a lot. I think this is a good example because Botswana developed, almost every African nation has certain resource wealth, right? But not every African nation is nearly as rich as Botswana, because Botswana, the difference between like a country like Botswana and many of the other surrounding countries is that Botswana, there was a guy who came back, became the president of Botswana, and he was legitimately a very anti-corruption person. Like he kicked out anybody who was corrupt. He was very much against any sort of graft or anti-democratic political maneuvering or anything like that. And he was able to engage productively with private actors in the economy to come into Botswana, mine the resource wealth, but also circulate it internally so they could do things like build schools, educate people, get them the jobs that are productive, and just in general industrialize the country. And so Botswana is probably the best country in sub-Saharan Africa to live in, because of those
From that
things, right? And
perspective,
that's all a story of institutions.
Yeah. When you're talking about how they maintain their institutions and recirculated their own money, is that would you say there's an argument for or against? I mean, would you say there's an argument like for protectionism in developing nations specifically, like the 5-year plans in South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because the word protectionism has such a negative connotation to so many economics people, but the reality is kind of the answer is yes, right?
I think Japan did that. They were like heavily protective of a lot of their electronics industries after World War II and stuff.
Yeah.
And
all the
the
Asian
result
tigers,
was, yeah.
all of them as well. It's the same story, right? It's just certain, like, and it depends on what you mean by protectionism, but like, again, having some,
I mean, just the
limited...
idea, like you're attempting to maintain internal control over your markets so that they can develop and grow, and they aren't like poaching labor, for instance. Like, that's a huge thing.
Well, for instance, this is an example of Norway, and Norway was a developed country at the time. But to be fair, this is an example of the type of, like, you could say, protectionist policy that led to longer term, more economic prosperity for Norway. I talked to a guy named Lars Doucette, who's like a doppelganger for Destiny, actually, to some degree. He looks kind of like Destiny. And he's a big Georgist guy, and he's also Norwegian. I mean, he says that Norway's the most Georgist country, but when Norway discovered their big oil deposits, they had this problem where it's like, okay, well, we know oil is valuable, obviously, but we don't have shit for people to do oil because it's Norway and we didn't have oil until we just discovered it. So there's nobody in the country that can like really work at this oil company, right? If we want to make one. And so what they did was they invited companies in to work the oil fields and like set up the initial capital investment. They subsidized capital investment significantly. So, hey, come here, establish wells, start drilling, Shell, Exxon, like all these other oil companies that had expertise. But there's some caveats. Because we're subsidizing a lot of your CapEx and your R&D expenditure, we're going to take a huge royalty, right? Huge royalty rates, right? But you're going to take that because you get the other part of the royalty, and we're subsidizing your CapEx and R&D. And the other caveats were that you had to hire Norwegian labor, like, I don't know, like 20% of your employees had to be Norwegian or something like that. And that was so that you could start to cultivate the domestic expertise so that eventually Norway could have a well-functioning domestic supply of technical and experienced oil laborers so that they could further socialize that, resource rent in the case of oil, right? And I think that those are examples of, protectionist policies to some degree because you're requiring companies to come in, give you part of their revenue if they want to come in. There's sort of limited foreign investor rights in the sense that you have to hire certain people and you have to give the government a big piece of your revenue and stuff like that. But it ultimately worked out because now Norway has an oil company. They have Norwegians mostly staffing it. And it's one of the better oil companies in the world in terms of extracting oil. And it just happens to be that the oil profits go to sort of the general treasury and, that investment is socialized to the people, right? And so stuff like that, where you require companies to come in and hire people from your country, you do take taxes and invest those taxes hopefully wisely into things that are, diversifying and good for your country, and that cultivate that sort of high-skilled domestic population so that you don't just have, like, for instance, like Exxon come in, it's all like Americans and fucking Europeans coming in and living in Malaysia for, several years, and you don't really hire very many Malaysians, and turns out Malaysia doesn't really get a ton of that, money or, results of any of that domestic wealth. A lot of it just goes abroad, right? Which doesn't really help Malaysian people, as an example. I don't know if Malaysia is a good example of this not working out, but it's just not a great. It's not great when that happens. So some forms of protectionism are probably good, like domestic subsidies, labor requirements, stuff like that. I think are good ideas.
Were institutions kind of like the World Bank and IMF that were? I don't know the exact history of these loans and these institutions. Would these institutions have failed in cultivating those nations, or were they like trying to exploit globalism as a way to extract wealth from these countries? I think this is something
Yeah.
I think you've discussed, but I'm just not familiar.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just depends on the framework you're using. Like, I think the best model to understand why the IMF and like World Bank does or like did the things it did and does the things it does today isn't like the more conspiratorial like socialists or like right-wing populists of like these countries are just trying to come in, fuck over these other countries, take all the money and leave, right? I think the best example, I mean, the best way to frame that is probably that these countries are, or these institutions had just like mistaken assumptions of how to cultivate wealth. And a lot of those assumptions have changed over time, right? So like the IMF today endorses things like I'm describing, like the IMF endorses things like capital controls, right? Welfare spending, not cutting certain forms of government spending. Like, hey, if you want to balance your budget, that's great, but don't cut education spending, right? Don't just destroy all of your fucking public investment just because you want to balance a budget, right?
In that
but in
vein-
the past,
Oh,
you know,
go
that's
ahead.
what they in the
it's just-
past, that's what they tended to do. It was like, hey, get rid of all your capital controls, get rid of all your, you know, a significant portion of like your state investment in health and education, and you know, stuff like that is just not. There's a very mixed reception of IMF and like World Bank investment because of this conditional financing that led to some of these government services being, you know, routed out. And there's some better and worse examples. I mean, there's you know, some examples of maybe the IMF succeeding, or the World Bank does a lot of development aid now, which is mostly considered positive. But yeah, I mean, I just, you know, I think that the sort of pre-2000, or you could say even like maybe pre-2010 IMF of just like deregulate, you know, get rid of a lot of your government expenditure and stuff. I don't know. That's not really, doesn't really create the best structures for long-term economic success. It doesn't seem like so.
It seems like austerity policy in general has just like died entirely. Do you agree or disagree with that? I mean, among the mainstream economists.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like, there are some countries that still like really value a balanced budget. Like, I think that the Netherlands is an example. I think even Norway. I mean, Norway typically values like a balanced budget, and there are different countries that do. I mean, even like developing countries. Like, I want to say Bangladesh is like or maybe Nepal. It's either Bangladesh or Nepal is like the one country in the world that has no outstanding debt, or like very, very little outstanding debt. But that, I mean, those are few and far between, right? So I agree. I mean, even Trump's a Republican, but he passed $3 trillion worth of stimulus, right? That's
You also
not
have to be
austerity.
careful that like the USD as a world reserve currency gives us a lot more flexibility with monetary policy than other countries around the world.
Well, no, that's totally true. But again, like I think that the sort of neocon, I mean, Bush handled a recession. The way he handled it was like a very, very small bailout of different sort of equity markets, right? But Bush didn't do like a ton of stimulus targeted towards regular people. But Trump did. I mean, Trump did the PPE loans, direct payments, right? Stuff like that. I just think that that you could argue that that's good or bad, right? I just think that it's a sign that kind of what Forethought is saying is that the sort of austerity style politics of in reaction to, you know, 2008 and 2009. I mean, that stuff just didn't really seem to work, and it certainly wasn't very successessful. So, I mean, it just fell out of style for sure.
Totally unrelated and sort of random question that I've had written down for a while that I've been meaning to ask an economist. It seems like economics as a field is just totally uninterested in the day-to-day behavior of like actual human beings.
Is that what behavioral econ is all about?
Behavioral econ is like super new, so I'm just like kind of wondering what is changing in like that you're seeing in the industry or in the research, because it seems like so much of personal finance should be dominated by economists in some way. It seems like they should have the most insight, but it's always like finance gurus.
Yeah, well, keep in mind too that like finance and econ are two totally different things that arguably have nothing to do with each other. Like an economist doesn't know anything necessarily about finance, and a guy that works in finance doesn't know anything necessarily about econ.
This is definitely true. So, I mean, your thought. So, your question is like, what's been changing about economic?
Yeah, I feel like personal finance like should be a branch of economics that like should be like really well studied, because it's driving so much of economics now. I mean, that's why behavioral economics exists.
Well, to some degree it is, right? So, I mean, like some economics people will say that, or even some finance people will say like finance is just a branch of economics. But obviously the disciplines have been segregated at most universities, so you don't get much cross-pollination. And that was my experience. I mean, I studied both in college, and kind of what Destiny is saying is totally true. Like, there's a lot of people in my economics program that didn't really know a ton about finance, and certainly vice versa. And so, yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate. But there probably is an argument that, you know, if you're going to study like finance, you should probably have a few basic economics courses, and, you know, if you're going to study economics, you should probably have some basic finance courses, because they're really related, right? Like someone like for instance, someone like Rage Pope, for instance, right? You know, he has a huge amount of finance knowledge and economics knowledge, and being able to synthesize those two things is valuable when you're talking about policy, because, you know, finance for a lot of economic regulation is sort of the ground level view, and the sort of actual individual implications of economic policy. You don't really learn that in a lot of economics discussions. But if you're a finance guy, you're very familiar, like, oh, this regulation, fuck, it's going to do exactly this or that to my business, right? And you might like it or not like it, but just that understanding is I agree that understanding is pretty valuable.
When it comes to like the personal influence of economic policy, I've heard this idea, but I don't know if it's true. Is there merit to the idea that inflationary increases in inflation cause a change in thinking amongst people, so they just stop participating in like competitive economics? They like stop shopping elsewhere. They just assume prices have soared everywhere.
So, sorry, I still have COVID brain. Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, sure. Is there merit to the idea that as inflation increases, the average consumer just assumes that as prices increase, there is no merit to comparing prices across the market?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, so basically, if there's broad-based inflation, then comparing the price level, like the PPP style stuff of like Argentina and the US, something like that, doesn't really make as much sense.
Oh wait, hold on. Like under normal circumstances, a person goes to a coffee shop, they buy a coffee, and
Right.
if they see their price increase, they might say, okay, this coffee shop is getting too expensive. I'm going to look at other coffee shops. One of the reasons given for tamping down on inflation so hard is that as inflation increases, people just stop looking and comparing prices at all. I don't know if there's any merit to that idea.
Oh, I mean, I've never heard that before. That does sound
Wait, that
pretty
people
odd.
stop
I mean, like,
comparing prices. Is that what we said?
Yes.
I imagine that's
it sounds
probably
like
gonna be
Forethought is saying.
It's going to be a function of like there's going to be probably different types of liquidity measured in markets in terms of like substitution from one product to another. So like for instance, like gas is something that is very easy to substitute because you see the prices outside of it, it's easy to drive to a gas station or whatever. But like I'm pretty sure that like stores pretty aggressively price match each other. Like from my memory, I mean, I don't know if like milk is going to be dramatically priced different from like one store to another, like down the street. I think that consumers are pretty savvy when it comes to price of products that they purchase quite often, where they have access to multiple people to buy from. That's my assumption.
Okay.
Right. It sounds like what you're saying is basically that if inflation, if there's like broad-based increases in the price level, then people will kind of just be like, man, what the fuck's even the point of shopping around? You know, because everything's going up anyway.
I do
but
think, like,
that
a little
happens.
counterintuitively, I do think people, unironically, I think they will measure their economic anxiety sometimes based on what pundits or politicians are telling them. I thought there was one study about this a while ago that had to do with people, like, how you felt the economy was going, like, tracked more closely with your, like, political party affiliation than any economic indicator. And I'll still meet people that are saying today, like, oh, no, like, gas prices are still super fucking high. And it's like, really? Have you filled your car up at all lately? I haven't seen that anywhere. But people, because they hear it and they're politically inclined, you know, they want to believe a certain thing about the economy, you know? Yeah.
Well, people are just not very well informed on most issues, and people are also very sort of self-centered in their thinking. Like,
sure, but I think
for instance,
intuitively, I think you'd imagine that people would know some of those things. Like, is the economy better or worse for you right now? Rather than going to what, like, a political pundit told them, you'd think they'd know. I mean, I would assume that, but
I don't know. I mean, because I think it generally is basically just your party identification and probably some like independent centrist style thinking. Like, for instance, I had an uncle who said he's like he voted for Biden, right? But he said he was like, oh man, I don't know about Biden. I think I might vote for Trump. Now already this is a pretty, like, from our perspective, a pretty weird person, because it seems weird the idea that someone would just flip from voting for Biden to Trump, because they're very different people.
Mm-hmm.
But his reasoning was, well, you know, my life just hasn't really gotten that much better since Biden became president. And that was his only he's like, I just feel like I'm kind of in the same place as I was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like, well, fuck. I mean, I could tell him like, no, Biden's done all this cool shit. But to be fair, it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're like a middle-aged person that works at a restaurant, I don't know what Biden's done directly for you specifically, right? I mean, you don't own an electric car, like you're not doing, you know, you didn't qualify
opinion,
for.
This is where one of those things like a sovereign wealth fund would be super advantageous, because like if the country was doing better as a whole, you could just look at a fund and see it grow. You know, you'd know directly. And I do think, I don't have a study to prove this, but I do feel like one way that people get a feel for the economy is by looking at like their 401ks and pensions. When they see those numbers go up and down, it probably heavily influences them for how they feel about things.
No, that's totally true. I mean, that's why, I mean, unfortunately, right, I think sovereign wealth funds could also align like almost political motivation as well, right? Because what a lot of leftists will say, rightly so, is that the stock market going up doesn't really mean a lot to the average person, because it doesn't, right? Most people don't own stock, right? They don't give a fuck about what happens in the stock market. But like if we had a sovereign wealth fund that issued a, you know, kind of a single universal share to people, kind of like Matt Brunig advocates for, well, then you could go into your like government run, you know, fucking American sovereign wealth fund account. And you could see the value of that increase or decrease over time. You could see the dividend check that you get every quarter, right? I mean, yeah, so I agree. There's a lot of almost like a class warfare style language that could be addressed by just having a more equitable distribution of capital income and wealth in general. And things like a sovereign wealth fund could help alleviate that. I mean, I think that, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that you get high levels of polarization in America at the same time when we have, like, very high levels of inequality. Yeah. Because, you know, you might look at the 50th percentile and look at, you know, hey, median wages over time, and sure, that number is going up, but inequality has also gone up, which means that, you know, when leftists point out, or even, like, right-wing populists point out that the incomes for like low income people hasn't gone up a ton over time. I mean, that's true, right? And that's you know, that's really unfortunate. So, you know, government policy, welfare and stuff could hopefully help. One advantage also of sovereign wealth funds is that it's not really welfare. It seems like Americans just don't like the word welfare or getting welfare. Yeah. And, you know, like there's a funny poll I saw recently, which was like, do you support more welfare benefits? And it's like 20-30% of people. But it's like, do you support more assistance to poor people? And it's like 80% of people support that. It's like, well, these are obviously the same thing, right? But people just have this
it's like
negative...
polling on the ACA versus Obamacare or whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. So I think that's like, not only don't call yourself a socialist, but don't say you're advocating for more welfare. Just say you're advocating for more assistance to poor people, right? So that you can, you know, get away from just that weird negative association people have. I mean, to be fair, part of the reason people don't like welfare in this country is because our welfare systems are designed pretty terribly. But you know, if we designed them better, people might also not hate them so much. But that's a long-term project, I guess.
When it comes to, I guess, I'm just gonna spitball some random economics questions I've had pinballing around in my head. Was the economic recovery and like the policies we put in place with the mass checks, the generous unemployment benefits, was that like, now that we've had some time, was that like the kind of the best it could have been? Because it seems like it has done a really miraculous job bouncing back the economy so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I don't know. I'm pretty like, I put a poll on my Twitter, I don't know, it was probably several months ago, and it was like, would you rather, I think the question was something like, you know, would you rather have like 4% unemployment with 6% inflation, or 6% unemployment with 4% inflation, or something like that? And most people picked the lower inflation over the lower unemployment. And I don't know, because I hear a lot of language. This was several months ago, I think. But I don't know, I was thinking, like, seeing the results and seeing how people kind of feel and think at this kind of present moment in time, it doesn't seem like most people agree with that. It seems like most people would rather have like a job in an environment where inflation is, you know, 6% instead of 2% than, you know, risk not, like, having a much higher chance of not being employed than having low inflation. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because obviously you end up with more significant local losses when unemployment's high and inflation's low versus moderately higher inflation but low unemployment.
Here's the
and
real
so
question. Oh, God.
Yeah, go on.
I was gonna say the real question is, how is unemployment still so low? What's going on?
How's the unemployment still so low?
Yeah,
I mean,
we've been jacking up interest rates for a while now. People keep getting mad. People keep saying that the huge unemployment surge is coming, but it seems like it hasn't happened yet. There are the tech layoffs, but is there any economist that's actually worried about the tech layoffs? People keep saying it's doom and gloom, but I'm pretty sure they hired a fuck ton of people over COVID. I don't know if it actually matters that like fucking Facebook and Google are laying people off. Like, is there going to be some huge wave of unemployment, or?
I mean, I don't.
In software, I don't think so. The market is just so unsatisfied. There's so much work left to be done in general.
That feels.
I don't
feel like in general. This is just going to be an anecdotal, like a feeling from being through airports and stores and late night everywhere. It really feels like we have like not enough people to run our shit right now. Like we are starving for workers in all sectors of the economy.
Well, but it's also there seems to have been a significant. It's like three kind of main things, right? One is obviously 1 million people died, so there's a lot of workers who died. And like
I don't think there's that many workers, right? Most of them are probably old and out of the workforce, right?
Well, it's like just you could probably imagine like a few 100,000 like working age people lost.
Sure, that's true.
Their lives, obviously,
probably
right?
A couple
So
100,000.
that's some. I wouldn't say that's most of it. I think most of it is the other two things, right? Okay. Which is, it seems like for one reason or another, there was like a significant change in employment preference. And a lot of the labor shortages you're seeing in specific industries, right? Or at least it's more pronounced in specific industries like hospitality and retail and restaurants, like these kind of like historically lower wage, more like high turnover jobs. People just don't want to do them at all anymore. I even heard I was reading a story the other day, or maybe I talked about it on stream or something, that Amazon literally, part of their strategy for warehouse placements is like, we want to place warehouses in areas that are decently populated, but we don't want them to be so populated that Amazon isn't an employer of choice, right? So a lot of the times Amazon warehouses are in these counties that have like 20 or 30,000 people. But in part because of the reasons that I'm saying, and in part because of Amazon's strategy, Amazon is actually having a hard time finding workers because they've actually cycled through like the entire fucking local labor market in some of the areas that they operate in, because so many people just quit and don't ever want to go back.
And there's literally no people left. Yeah.
And another part of it is a lot of people just retired, right? Like labor force participation is still a decent degree lower than it was pre-pandemic.
Yeah,
and a lot of that is just people retiring.
I feel like we've been talking for a long time about like the boomers need to quit, and we always think they're going to, but then they keep working and working, and then it feels like COVID was an opportunity for a lot of older people to find like, oh, okay, I am exiting the labor market. I'm done with this.
Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of it was like, hey, my house is worth like 50% more than it was 3 years ago. I've got a shitload of money in my inflated 401k. Like, I can retire today on $3 million or something like that, and then I can, just leave and not really give a shit, right? And a lot of people made that decision. It's totally rational for them to make that decision. And arguably, I mean, like you're saying, a lot of people were saying one of the problems with the baby boomers is they're taking up all these middle and upper management positions, right, for longer than we would expect or we would want, right? Yeah, get rid of these fucking boomers from their jobs, right? And so, and so to some degree that could be positive for many people, but like I'm looking at it now. 25
rough transitory period where we've got a lot of old people that we kind of have to take care of until they die, and they're living like longer than ever and everything. And our social security age might be set too low, and there's like these retirements and pensions. Like, it's a lot to deal with.
I'm looking at it here. It looks like labor force participation amongst prime age workers is higher than it was pre-COVID, but the total labor force participation
is probably down quite a bit.
It's still 1 or 2 points lower.
It's not
well, yeah, I mean, 1 or 2 points lower. I mean, you're talking, I don't know, a million and a half workers right there. But I think those are kind of the three things. It's like people dying from COVID, people just changing their preferences and like reevaluating their lives, and people retiring early. It is causing this tighter labor market. So, and I just think that back to the Fed question, I don't think there's a strong case for the Fed more aggressively raising rates just to cause unemployment to bring down inflation. I think it's probably still better for them to more moderately wait, like, hey, at 25 basis points every month or two or however often they meet.
I think that's a pretty good case. Because if you're the Fed and there's another 2008 crisis and your interest rates are already at 1%, like, what can you do there? Like I want them to have like some interest rates in the chambers, like some tools that they
Yeah.
can use to modify the economy should things turn
Well,
down again.
That's fair, but if they raise rates too aggressively, they have a solution for a problem they created, right? Where I'm saying is like it's probably better to just not create that problem in the first place, right? Like you don't have to lower interest rates if there's no recession, right? And if you more moderately raise interest rates and tame down inflation over a slower period of time, to me that's probably better than having this almost more like reactionary interest rate policy where it's like, oh, we raised rates a ton, caused a recession, now inflation's lower, and now we can lower rates again because inflation's lower, right?
I mean, with how aggressive they've been, the economy's still been firing on all cylinders. So I'm just like, I don't know. It seems
Yeah.
like the right cause.
It's just a matter of how aggressively you raise the rates, right? Like, I think that they should still be coming up because, again, inflation it's not a solved problem yet. But it's just, I don't like these 50 basis points, 75 basis points increases. They've gone away, but the Fed seems to be signaling like a 50 basis point increase because they don't have they're not satisfied with the rate of disinflation at this point. And the Fed's kind of come out more openly and said that we want to see unemployment go up so that consumption goes down, so that inflation goes down. But if we're just talking about the best thing for people in the economy, I'm just not sure if the best thing for people in the economy is basically inflation going from 6% to 2%, but at the same time, unemployment goes from, I think they said it would go maybe all the way up to 7% to see a disinflation of 2 to 3 extra points. I just don't know if 7% unemployment is worth like an extra or a couple basis point or a couple of points less than inflation. It's an arguable position either way. Like I think Noah Smith made the argument in an article that it's a utilitarian argument. Hey, inflation affects everybody, but unemployment is only going to affect the people unemployed. And so under a utilitarian framework, right, it's better to have lower inflation and higher unemployment because that doesn't hurt as many people. But
yeah, I was going to ask that earlier about the poll about like, would you prefer higher inflation or unemployment? I would always prefer higher. I'd always prefer higher unemployment because I'm not getting unemployed, right? And I wonder how many people are thinking that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, like to be fair, like someone like me, it's probably like I'm in commodities and I'm a pretty like, I guess you could consider me a high skilled employee. Like I'm probably not going to get laid off because interest rates are going up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so selfishly, it's probably better for the Fed to increase interest rates significantly so that I'm not paying as much for like, groceries and gas and like whatever other stuff, right? Or like I could, just regular stuff like that. But in terms of, it just seems like one of the lessons we should have learned, and I think we did to some degree, about things like almost like a more hyper globalization or having like lower welfare policy or like being more, I think it's hawk versus dove, and like hawkish people are more inclined to lower inflation versus lower unemployment. Like, it's just that these localized losses are just, they're really localized, right? And they really hollow out a lot of communities, right? And that even if we have, if we have 7% unemployment rate, a guy like me is probably not going to feel that, but it's so disproportionately weighted
because it
towards
doesn't
certain areas.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
It's like climate
Yeah.
change, right? When people are like, who cares about 1 or 2 degrees? And it's like, well, it's not 1 or 2 degrees, averaged over the entire planet. It's going to be some places aren't changing at all, and some might change by 4 or 5 degrees, which is significant,
Yeah, exactly. Like some countries, like a country like, I don't know, like a country like Canada might not be as affected as a country like Indonesia. Like Indonesia is going to fucking, like half the country will be underwater,
Yeah.
but like Canada might be mostly okay. And so I don't know. I just like, I think it was, I can't remember what the report was, but I think that was the report, was like to lower unemployment or to lower inflation to 2%, we would need to see like 7% unemployment. And it's like, fuck, man, that is like a lot of extra people unemployed. And we don't have like a really good, it would maybe be easier if we had a good welfare system, but we don't. Like these people would just be fucked, right?
Yeah.
They wouldn't be getting very good unemployment assistance. They wouldn't get a lot of welfare assistance. We don't have a universal healthcare system. Like maybe they'd be on Medicaid if they fell, into a low enough income for their household. But like I just don't know if I don't think that's worth it. I mean, maybe there's a great argument for it, but I'd probably prefer a more, a more dovish, more like unemployment focused Fed at this point. And I guess politically it might be more advantageous as well, because a lot of people have said that the lackluster Republican midterm result is because, inflation was high, but unemployment was also low. So it seems like people might be more reactionary when they're unemployed versus when they're employed,
Sure.
but inflation's higher than it should be. Which, you know, I mean, that's conjecture to some degree, but it kind of makes sense to me when I think about it.
When it comes to the Fed as a political entity, do you think they should ever be held accountable to like any sort of popular vote? Because I just
no.
don't think they should.
That's never gonna happen.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a strong argument for depoliticizing and like having like operationally independent to at least some degree economic institutions. Like I think a lot of welfare policy should be centrally administered and relatively operationally independent. Like it shouldn't be as discretionary. Like for instance, like Social Security is not discretionary, right? They don't vote on like funding Social Security every single year, but a lot of other welfare policies they do. And I think it'd probably be better to have a more like universal and non-discretionary welfare system that's centrally administered than having the completely terrible framework that we have now, where it's like, I thought about doing a video, but the reason I didn't do this video was because it would literally be too hard to research. I thought about doing a video to demonstrate how complicated U.S. welfare policy is by taking a journey on how to get food stamps in every single state. Because every single fucking state has different rules and regulations and thresholds and benefit payouts for getting food stamps.
Yeah, you
because
have a
we have
really
this
big problem when you have like when you turn on the radio in the United States and you hear like, oh, contact these lawyers to make sure you're getting your full Social Security benefits, and it's like, what? Like, that's our
right.
government. Is it really that complicated? Like, you can't even get like something you've paid into your whole life. Like, that's kind of insane.
Right. I mean, and it's just like, unemployment insurance is another good example where like the boosted unemployment insurance was great, but so many people didn't qualify for it who thought they did, and so many people weren't able to get unemployment insurance basically because of all these different bureaucratic hurdles that you have to go through to qualify for it. And it just shouldn't be like that. You know, if you want to have a good unemployment system, just give people money when they lose their job. Like, fuck, that just shouldn't be that complicated a concept, right? But it is. I mean, because part of that's the motivation of, like, we have a federal government, so we don't have a lot of centrally administered things. But it seems like our best government services in America are the centrally administered ones, right? Things like Medicare, Social Security, right? I mean, people really like those programs in part because they're simple and they're centrally administered, and so there's not there's not huge different qualification standards for Social Security depending on what state you live in. That's just stupid. That's like the dumbest way to fucking do welfare. You know, I just don't get. I get the logic behind it, but the logic isn't like how to what do you call it? The logic was never like how do we make the best administered welfare system, or at least it doesn't seem that way. It's just like how do we decentralize these institutions because we're skeptical of like federal authority over certain things, and that's not. It just doesn't seem to work out that way. So.
Okay, well, I got nothing else. Thanks for answering my questions.
No problem. Worth thought. Well, I gotta go to the gym, Destiny. It was really good talking to you. I will definitely reach out to. I'll DM Matt Brunig to see if we can get that epic lay socialism conversation set up. I think it'd be interesting, if only for me, if only for the audience of one. But it was good talking to you guys.
All right, have fun. Be careful. Buddy.
Yeah, no problem.
See ya.